I'm not a scientist, but I'm glad that if I have to be on a panel with doctors and esteemed scientists, that I get to follow my hero, Dr. B.J. Freeman. Many of you know, as Dr. Freeman said, she's been at this a really long time. She's been a huge advocate for communities of color. And just on a personal note, she diagnosed my son. So I just owe a great deal to her and her expertise and her work. So I just want to give her another round of applause for all of the work she's doing. So now she's trying to send those families that are wearing purple and all the families that are here today that are part of Special Needs Network, just raise your hand because I think it's so amazing when you see all of those families that have come out today because they care about this issue. Thank you for being here. When I think about the topic of changing the definition of autism, I can't help but be reminded of the thousands of families, mostly black and brown, across the county and the state that until very recently had no voice, felt isolated, alone, and were frustrated by systems of care that did not acknowledge the unique challenges they face in raising children with autism and other developmental disabilities. And although advocacy groups like Public Council, Disability Rights California, Special Needs Network, and Fiesta Educativa have made the issues of underserved communities and minorities with autism an issue that's now being discussed at all levels of government, this wasn't the case less than a decade ago when Dr. Freeman diagnosed my son, Marty, with autism. At the time of his diagnosis, I couldn't find events like these, conferences on advocacy, and even the discussion about black and brown families in underserved communities. It just wasn't being talked about. This condition, autism, was ravishing communities of color, and families were facing tremendous obstacles in getting a basic diagnosis and access to services. And although so much progress has been made, and now these issues of our community, of underserved communities, is a part of the larger dialogue that's taking place on autism, the dialogue on healthcare delivery, and it's become really an issue of social justice, as the supervisor so eloquently reminded us this afternoon. We really can't lose sight of the very poignant story that Martha Matthews, an attorney at Public Counsel, my colleague, told on Monday at the Senate Select Committee on Autism. Martha told a story about a little boy named Angelo. And Angelo is a boy that fits many of the classic symptoms of autism that we saw Dr. Patterson talk about. And despite Angelo having limited language, repetitive behaviors, social disorders, and cognitive disabilities, his family fought for 6 long months to get him a diagnosis and to get him the services that he needed. They were sent from regional center to the Social Security office to the Department of Mental Health Services and to just about every agency you can imagine in this city. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, this family was told, no, no, no. No, your son doesn't have autism. No, you're not entitled to services. And these were 2 everyday working parents, laborers in fact, who were struggling to get a diagnosis of autism that was so clearly, as demonstrated by Dr. Patterson. Yet it took a heroic effort on the part of these 2 individuals to finally get the diagnosis and just to begin some basic services for Angelo. And what Martha shared with us is that Angelo's story was not an isolated incident. In fact, it reminded her and reminded all of us that this happens every day in communities of color. And it's a vivid reminder for us today about how much work is still needed in underserved communities as we struggle to end the inequities in diagnosis and treatment. And with the issue of disabilities and inequalities in services looming so large, the prospect of changing the definition of autism, Dr. Freeman, is scary. It's scary for us that have been on the battlegrounds, that have been in this community working to try to get kids services. And if we're going to talk about changing the definition, the question has to be asked, what about IDEA? What about the Lanterman Act? What about the California Education Code? And what about all of those statutes that also provide protection for our kids? Without changes to those statutes, the change in the definition could end up being a direct assault and affront to hundreds of thousands of kids who are like Angelo. We have simply come too far, and we've made too much progress to turn back now. We cannot let a few dictate the future of thousands of our kids. nor can we let a few, under the guise of good science, reverse the positive trend towards closing the diagnostic gap and making autism treatment available for all. If the past has taught us anything, it has taught us that the label of autism is both scientific and political, that the label drives the services, and without the label, our kids are left behind. They're isolated, they're undiagnosed, they're left without treatment. Many are relegated to institutional care, prisons, and state hospitals. So I know firsthand that we as a collective body have the ability to help Angelo and the thousands of kids like him. Drawing from our successes with passing an insurance mandate bill this year, all of us, lawyers, doctors, scientists, elected officials, policymakers, we all have to bring our collective will to bear on this issue. We have to stand up, we have to speak out, we have to take action. We have to send a loud message that our kids matter, that kids with behavioral problems, language and social disorders are entitled to quality care, that you can't end a health care crisis, an epidemic, by changing the definition. You cannot eliminate thousands of kids that need services. We can't allow the changes to the DSM to eliminate services for our kids. We've come too far. As President Obama reminded us in his speech in Columbus this morning, on the issue of autism, the only direction is forward. Thank you.